So, as much as jumping into the chapters that we're going to look at tonight, I thought it would be useful to have a quick recap. Because if you're like me, you might have missed one or two, if not lots. And that's okay, because generally we're able to catch up. So we started in Joshua, and the whole story of Joshua tells the story of God's people journeying back into the promised land, doesn't it? So we're right there, and it's all about the fulfillment of the covenant promise made to Abraham so many years before. And that's right back when we start in Joshua. And when we start, it starts on a bit of a kind of note, because although Joshua is taking on the mantle of leading the Israelites, we also see Moses just died. So it's kind of a moment in history, and a moment for Moses where he stands up and he takes on that leadership, and God has to remind him. Can you remember what he has to remind him? To be courageous, to not fear. And he doesn't just remind him once, he reminds him several times throughout this book. And we get to see that maybe Joshua needed that. And I don't know about you, but I definitely need to be reminded of that frequently, probably more than I'd like to admit. So we see how God journeys them through, taking Joshua beginning this mantle as the leader. But the leader being somebody that is calling those people back to God and reminding them time and time again, who are you serving? Who should we be serving? Who am I serving? And that's kind of where Joshua starts, and then it kind of carries on, and we've gone through various different battles and victory upon victory upon victory upon victory, and God brings them through so much when they're listening to him. There's a couple of bits as well, isn't there, where where they don't happen to win, but generally it's because they've gone awry. They haven't listened to what God wants them to do, and so they've just kind of wandered off somewhere, or somebody's been really deceitful. But when they come back, that's when they get the victory. So we come, and then we came last time, we were in chapters 16 and 17, and it was Alison looking at some of the division of the land. So the first part of Joshua is that journeying into the land and them having to fight and fight and fight and fight and fight a little bit more. And that's about 7 years. And then last time, Alison took us through some of the division of the land, and I think Carol was there as well the week before doing the division of the land. And so we get to this point, chapter 18, the division of the rest of the land. And it's funny because there's the first line. So if you can read with me, we're going to go with chapter 18, verse 1. And it says, "Then the whole congregation of the people of Israel assembled at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. The land lay subdued before them." It's kind of one verse that to me almost kind of is thrown into the middle of this. We're dividing this bit of land and this bit of land and this and this. And then Joshua moves the people because we're not told why he's moved them other than the fact that they're assembling the tabernacle. And so if they're doing that, then surely they had to disassemble it beforehand. So we don't kind of get all of that information, but we get to this point where all of the people, all of the congregation, and there's a bit of debate over whether that meant all of Israel, or if that just means all of the people that it would have taken to disassemble, and then all the people that were camped at Gilgal, which is where they had been their main meeting place, and they'd gone out to places to do a battle, and then they've withdrawn to Gilgal, and then they've gone back out. And so they've gone from Gilgal to this place called Shiloh. And there would have been quite a few people there. Like, if you think about it, that's quite a few tribes, quite a few people, which would have been a bit of a sight to behold, all of these people setting up the tent of meeting. And so we see this tabernacle, the dwelling place of God, and they would have had a vested interest because they wanted to be near the dwelling place of God. I mean, who doesn't, right? You know, if you don't want to be near God, then I think there's something a bit strange. But they wanted to know where God was. So this tabernacle is moved to this place called Shiloh. Now, Shiloh means place of rest, which I just found really interesting, because it's like God moves them on from Gilgal and all the fighting, and when we've started to get the division of land, and God brings them to this place, and it's a place of rest. It's a place of rest that becomes the tent of meeting that is set up for like 300 and some years before they then move down to Jerusalem. And there's this place of rest. And it's like God says, you know what? Where I am, there is rest. And so often in the Bible we see that. We see that the place of God is the place of rest. And it is the place of rest where Joshua brings the people together. It was also a natural amphitheatre. I think I've said that right, amphitheatre. Yes. And so if you don't know what that is, it just means that it was kind of on a hill, and then the people could sit, and they would be able to see the tabernacle. It also meant that they didn't need a PA system, unlike us generally these days, because Joshua could speak in a normal voice, and the people would hear because of how the natural land sat. Which is also, it's just like little practicalities of, you think, where shall we put it? Where should we do it? Should we go here or there? It's also kind of in the middle of the land. So it's a meeting place where everybody can get to from the different corners of where they were going to be divided out to. It's somewhere that they could draw back to. And it wasn't too far for anybody. Nobody could really complain, well, you're really close to it, and I'm miles away, because although they were, nobody was that far. But we see that they come back to this place of rest, and then we see in verse 2, it says, Verse 2, it says, there remained among the people of Israel 7 tribes whose inheritance had not yet been apportioned. So from this place of peace, Joshua moves on. Can you guess what's about to happen? Anybody? Actually, it's not really interactive, is it? So, if you can't guess, they're about to divide up some more land. If you can think, well, what should they have done? Joshua is saying, that maybe it should have already been done. And I think that's where we get the title for this week's study, which is The Problem of Procrastination. Great big word. Procrastination, putting things off. And they've done that, haven't they? So these guys that are still haven't got their land have put it off. So we see in verse 3, it says, so Joshua said to the people of Israel, how long will you put off going in to take possession of the land, which the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you? Feels like a bit of a telling off. I don't know about you. Maybe a telling off, maybe an encouragement, maybe oh, come on. Well, how long is it going to take you? How many times have you ever heard a parent tell their child things multiple times, and by the end of that time, they're starting to get to a bit like, will you just do it already? Joshua is saying, what are you doing? Come on, get on with it. It's a bit like pulling up weeds in a garden, and I was thinking about this. If you don't plant into the cleared up weeds, then something will grow, won't it? Weeds will grow back, probably a bit more viciously and quicker, because they're like, oh, you've given us all this lovely space. And so the weeds grow back. If you don't plant into it, then the weeds will just come back worse than before. And that's part of what was going to happen if they didn't go and take the inherited land. They'd been through and they'd tried to clear it out. They'd said, this is the land that we are supposed to have. But then they didn't dwell in that land straight away. Or not these tribes. Anyway. And sometimes I think we're very good at clearing weeds. Actually, some of us are, some of us not so. Don't look at my garden. But weeds are one of those things that you can pull up sometimes quite quickly. But in our lives, how often do we pull things up quite quickly? But unless we start to fill that space with something that actually we want to grow there, other things will take over. So Joshua says, with this, how long are you going to take? It's also a little bit like a gift as well. Sometimes, if you think about it, at Christmas, those gifts might be sat. And you want to open them, don't you? If you don't open the gift, how do you ever know what's inside it? Yeah? And it's like they had this gift sat here, and they'd kind of pulled at the wrapper, they'd shook it a little bit, but they didn't open it fully to be able to enjoy it. And it might have meant that they had to do some work, because generally, when you open a gift, it is something you have to do something with to be able to, even if it's a picture that you have to put on the wall, you still have to do that, putting it on the wall to enjoy it. And that's where they were at. You know, one of the arguments for not having children is that they cost too much, emotionally, physically, which is kind of true. But then you miss out on the joy that children bring. And the Bible teaches us that children are a blessing. And if we don't have children, then the world's going to be a bit stuffed, really, isn't it? Because we need the next generation. And it's that thing of constantly going back to look and to open that gift and to not worry about the cost of it to keep it going. Now, it doesn't tell us exactly why they procrastinated. So we could guess. Let's have a little bit of a guess. Maybe they were a bit weary. They've been battling for 7 years. I think I'd be a bit weary after battling, having seen some wins, some not so great victories. I haven't seen God do some amazing things as well. You'd think that stirred them on, but some of them might have been a bit weary. I think as well maybe they'd got a bit contented. They were living the nomadic lifestyle, which meant that they could go and then move on. And maybe they didn't have to put down the roots and do the continuous job of weeding. So they'd weeded a little bit, but they didn't then have to plant and then keep weeding to keep the crops growing well. And they were pretty good at moaning as well, weren't they? And they spent a lot of time moaning about things that they had the power to change. And sometimes I think we're pretty good at moaning, especially when we've got the power to change. Maybe not. And I wonder as well if they'd got a bit lazy. Often the scholars talk about these tribes as being the ones that have, the others had got the get up and go, the motivation to take hold of their inheritance, whereas these 7 tribes hadn't. These 7 tribes had just kind of carried on and gone on and let the others go off and do their thing. They were quite contented to stay and just sit and do what they needed to do. Maybe they'd got a bit lazy. But God brought them to this place of rest. But he didn't leave them there. And this is where the leadership of Joshua comes in. That Joshua knew that they needed a bit of a push. But he didn't just say, go on, off you go. He instructed them. He gave them a way to move on in their laziness or their weariness or whichever it was. He gave them a way to move on. He calls them, and we see as we move down, Joshua says in verse 4, provide 3 men from each tribe, and I will send them out that they may set out and go up and down in the land. They shall write a description of it with a view to their inheritance, and then come to me. They shall divide it into 7 portions. Judah shall continue in his territory to the south. And so they go out and they describe it. They do what Joshua says, these men. And actually, sometimes it does take not taking everybody to go straight away, but to, a little bit like Joshua sent out the spies in the land. He knew some people can go out and do this job and come back. And so they collated this information. And then it tells us that Joshua then moves on to be able to cast lots before the Lord. And I think we've talked a little bit about casting lots before, that it was done before the Lord, and we kind of think of it as gambling a little bit when you hear it in today's society, casting lots. And in a sense, they did, but it was a case of they did it before the tabernacle, before God. And they all agreed and they all knew this is whatever it lands on, that's what God wants to happen. And I was thinking about these tribes, and I was thinking how they got the job of the individuals that went out to describe the land. They had the job of dividing it into areas, and that must have been a pretty difficult job in some ways. But it did get me thinking of something that my mum used to do when I was little. She always said to me and my brother, if there was a cake or whatever to share, one of you cuts, the other gets to pick first. Because then you always make sure you're making it even. Because you're not going to give it, I'm not going to say, I'll just take this a little piece and a big piece, because my brother would have had the big piece, and I wanted that. Whereas if you make it equal, then everybody gets a similar amount. And they wouldn't have known who it was that would get which portion of the land, because that was done before the Lord by Joshua. And so they did this, and they came back, and then we see Joshua go through the description of the different tribes and their inheritance. And it's this word inheritance that is an interesting word, something that was due to them, that was something that they were going to get for them and for their next generations and the generations to come. But Joshua does this, and I'm not going to go through, partly because I can't pronounce all the names. It goes through lots of lovely names, and it was really important that it's really detailed and described well so that there wouldn't be the arguments over, oh, that's my bit of land, and or my, but that hill's mine. Actually, no, it was all written down in the book. It was all described by these men that went out, and then it was divvied out. And nobody argues over it. I mean, that's a feat in of itself. Like, maybe that's a bit of a miracle of God. They don't argue when their lots are given to them. That's what's given. That's what we take. And we see most of the tribes come and they go. And then towards the end of chapter 19 even, we start to see how Joshua brought it all together. So all of these different cities and the inheritance of the tribes comes to the end of the chapter, and we see the inheritance for Joshua. So if we skip over all the inherited land, I know that's a bit controversial. They got it, they enjoyed it. We get to verse 49, and it says, when they had finished distributing the several territories of the land as inheritances, the people of Israel gave an inheritance among them to Joshua the son of Nun. By command of the Lord, they gave him the city that he asked for. And I found it really interesting that Joshua doesn't take his lot first. He's given his tribe the lot, but because he's the leader, he's done quite a lot. He has a lot of responsibility. Generally, in our society, if you've got a lot of responsibility, you're probably going to be well paid, aren't you? But that's not what we see here. We see at the very end, Joshua comes for his inheritance. And he doesn't even come for it. They ask him because they know that that's the right thing to do. And it's in this that we see that Joshua's character is incredible. He is humble. He is prepared to work, because this place that he asks for, it then goes on to say, the Timnath Serah in the hill country of Ephraim, which is his tribe, and he rebuilt the city and settled in it. So he didn't even ask for somewhere that was already nicely laid out. You know, he's not the youngest person here, but yet he takes his inheritance, he asks for somewhere, and he goes and he rebuilds. He provides for his family again. And Joshua, time and time again, amazes us with the humility and the wisdom that he has. It's a place that is not too far from the tabernacle, so actually for him, that's really helpful, that he can get back there quite easily. But it's also somewhere that was quite a desert place. He had to work at it. It wasn't the most fruitful of land. But we see that he does work at it, he rebuilds it, and he chooses to do that. And it's when we see that that is something that God asks of us, to be prepared to be humble enough, to be prepared to serve one another, to be prepared to take our inheritance. God promises that he will give us that inheritance, and we can have it. But we do have to do things for it. So these, we pick up in verse 51, finally, before the end of the chapter, and it says, "These are the inheritance that Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun and the heads of the fathers' houses of the tribes of the people of Israel distributed by lot at Shiloh before the Lord, at the entrance of the tent meeting, and so they finished dividing the land." It's like, phew, the division of the land is done. Time to pack up and go home, right? But you'll learn that actually that's not quite what Joshua has to do. Joshua's still got work to do, even though he's also still got to rebuild his own land. He's got to work for his family to do that and to instruct that. But we'll learn in chapter 20 that he has more to do for the people. So within these two chapters, we see a whole multitude of things. And I know I've skipped over lots, and you were probably hoping that I'd read you all the names and muddle through them. Sorry, I've ducked out on that one. But we see lots of things, and we firstly see that time and time again, we're reminded to come to that place of rest. So they were brought out of one thing to a place of rest, and that was somewhere that they then had to keep coming back to, because part of who they were as a people was to keep coming back. Every time they came back to have a feast was that place of rest in Shiloh. And secondly, in the words of Joshua, how long will we put off taking possession of the inheritance that we have? Now, for you and I, that might not be a literal land. We might not have a promised land somewhere that we've got to go and march into and clear the land. I mean, it might be. You might have a house somewhere that's a promised house for you. But that's not always how it works for us. But there's always things that God's asking us to do. And the challenge for me in reading this has been to say, Lord, what is it that you're asking me to do? What are the promises that you've laid out in your word that I should be taking hold of? Now, the big promises, the promises that I am saved and what that means in my life, but the little promises that I don't need to fear, that I don't need to be anxious, because God is in control. And today, one of the things that I really wanted to remind you of is that whatever your inheritance is, God is in control, but he wants you to have it. And so as we go and we kind of sit in our groups, we're going to look at some Bible promises and we're going to think about our inheritance. And I just really want to encourage you to think through what it is and to ask God to help you to know what it is that he wants you to inherit. So let's pray. Lord, I thank you for this evening, and I thank you for your promises. Lord, there are so many promises in the Bible. And I thank you for the wisdom of Joshua to encourage us to step forward and to not procrastinate. Sometimes there's wisdom in waiting, but sometimes, God, you just want us to get on with it. And Lord, I pray you'd help us to unwrap that gift and explore all the things that you have for each one of us tonight. Thank you, Lord. Amen.
I love you, Lord. Oh, your mercy never fails me. All my days I've been held in your hands. From the moment that I wake up until I lay my head, I will sing of the goodness of God.